Hello, everyone. I think we can start now. Thank you for joining us for the first event of the Yavuz Sezer Memorial Talk, organized as a tribute to our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Yavuz Sezer, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year due to COVID-19 pandemic. I am Mehmet Kentel, the Research Project Manager at the İstanbul Research Institute and a postdoctoral fellow at Koç University's Research Center for Anatolian Civilization. This event is co-organized by these two institutions, as well as by Boğaziçi University's Department of History and Yavuz Sezer's friends. While this is a sad occasion for all of us, we are very humbled to have Professor Chartier as our inaugural speaker to launch this series. I am leaving the rather needless task of introducing Professor Chartier to the chair of our event, one of Yavuz Sezer's closest friends, Dr. Aslan Gürbüzel. Dr. Gürbüzel is an assistant professor of Ottoman history at the Institute of Islamic Studies, McGill University. She's the historian of the early modern period, focusing on Ottoman Sufism, Ottoman cultural history, and manuscript studies. The followers of our institute might recognize her wonderful work from our current exhibition, Memories of Humankind, Stories from the Ottoman Manuscript, of which she was one of the advisors and gave one of the associated talks. I'm grateful that she and other friends of Yavuz came up with this idea of a memorial lecture series and brought these institutions together, in all of which Yavuz spent a lot of time, and I think all of which were quite dear to his heart. So with this, I am now leaving the floor to Aslı so that she can introduce the talk series, the legacy of Yavuz Sezer, and of course, introduce today's speaker, Roger Chartier. Thank you so much.
Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending where you are. I'd like to first thank Mehmet for this kind and generous introduction that he started this event with. And I am trying to share screen, so if I may be allowed to share the screen while I'm introducing the talk series. It is my honor to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of Yavuz Sezer Memorial Talks. This series is organized in honor of our dear friend and colleague Yavuz Sezer, whom we prematurely lost last spring, March 2021, just over 6 months ago. Apologies. Yavuz Sezer Memorial Talks is co-organized by the İstanbul Research Institute, as Mehmet has just explained, Koç University's Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations, the Department of History at Boğaziçi University, and the Yavuz Sezer Memorial Initiative. All right, here we go. And the Yavuz Sezer Memorial Initiative, established by Yavuz Sezer's friends to carry forward his multidimensional approach to urban history, which brought together spaces, people, and ideas. Yavuz Sezer was born in Bakırköy, Istanbul, on the 13th of September, 1979. After spending his early years in Koca Mustafa Pasha, Yavuz attended the Vefa High School between the years 1993 and 1997. During these years, he would see on a daily basis the Şehit Ali Pasha Library, one of the Istanbul libraries that he would later dedicate his career to. After his high school years, he started his education at Boğaziçi University's History Department, where he completed his undergraduate study, followed by an MA at the same department. During his MA years, namely 2003 to 5, he also taught the making of the modern world, where he built a reputation for his engaging style of teaching that combined sound erudition with an animated elocution that was so typical of him. Upon completing his MA at Boğaziçi, Yavuz Sezer studied in Budapest for a year. This experience led to the publication of his first scholarly article in 2007, entitled Hungarian Orientalism, Turanism, and Katolikos İstanbul. His interest in architectural inspirations across national boundaries would continue throughout his life and would lead him to conduct research in the architecture of many regions from Central Europe to the Caucasus. To this already broad spectrum of knowledge, he would later add an interest in American architecture during his years in Boston, namely 2008 to 2013. In 2008, Yavuz Sezer began his doctoral studies at the History, Theory, and Criticism of Architecture and Art group at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He completed his PhD program in 2016 with a very successful dissertation entitled The Architecture of Bibliophilia, 18th-century Ottoman Libraries. And I'll say a few words about this dissertation in a moment. This dissertation, I'm happy to announce, is currently being prepared for publication as a scholarly monograph. And I hope that we will be sharing more news about the book in the next installations of this speaker series. After his dissertation, Yavuz Sezer taught at the Faculty of Architecture, Bilgi University from 2013 until his passing away in March 2021. Yavuz Sezer's profound knowledge and passion for Ottoman urban, cultural, and architectural history was truly extraordinary, even unique. What was even more unique about him was his never-ending generosity when it came to sharing his learning. In academic talks, social occasions, casual encounters, he shared his ideas and knowledge with a contagious excitement. In addition to the educational architectural tours of the city that he was happy to organize for his own students and the students of his colleagues, Yavuz Sezer's favorite pastime was to visit Istanbul's many monuments with his friends and share his insights and interpretations with them or with us. In fact, no matter what was going on in his life, he was always ready to join anyone to visit any monument in and outside of Istanbul. In short, Yavuz Sezer lived and breathed history and architecture, identifying intimately with these intellectual interests. The same identification quite possibly led him to conduct research on libraries. He was a person who spent the majority of his time at libraries and was deeply fascinated by them, be them historical or modern libraries. In fact, during the COVID lockdowns of his final months, the greatest challenge for him was staying away from libraries and archives, spaces where he was in the habit of meeting with his friends and colleagues. So for anyone who knew Dr. Yavuz Sezer, it is difficult to not draw parallels between his work and the way he lived his life. As I recently reread his description of the Ottoman cultural idioms about human libraries, for instance, about walking libraries, more literally, ayaklı kütüphane, I found myself reflecting on the autobiographical nature of the lines where he praised this cultural aspiration, namely the belief in the capacity of human minds to become infinite libraries, or as Professor Chartier put it in his order of books, the capacity of human minds to become libraries without walls. Similarly, it seems to me now to be no coincidence that the beautiful analysis of the Kaaba-inspired book cubicles of Ottoman libraries, these book repositories and showcases that were built to resemble Kaaba and that were considered in poetic images to resemble Kaaba. It seems to be no coincidence that this analysis came from Yavuz Sezer, and a person who strongly identified with the ideals of the sacrality of reading, and the sacredness of knowledge that these architectural structures symbolized. So I think, looking at his lines before me and remembering many conversations in which Yavuz Sezer shared his excitement, that has never subsided since he first started his research. In the last 6 months, the untimely loss of Yavuz Sezer has reverberated far and wide, bringing together people who knew him at different stages of his life, in different capacities as close friends, colleagues, teachers, students, or fellow library goers. Among these many efforts, of which this series is one part I wanted to share, this picture from this past June, when Yavuz Sezer's colleagues and family came together to plant a Judas tree in his name in his Boğaziçi University campus, symbolizing his love for Istanbul, but also symbolizing the fact that his roots were always there on the Boğaziçi campus. So I want to say that grief is a mixed terrain, one with many different layers. And on one hand, we have been grieving the loss of a loved one, a loyal friend, a reliably open and joyful presence in our lives. And this personal gap will not be filled. On the other hand, however, we have been grieving the many inspirational, intellectual conversations we were sure to have with Yavuz Sezer. We counted on him for bringing new interests and ideas into our lives for many more decades to come. So the speaker series, namely the Yavuz Sezer Memorial Series, is dedicated to the cause of sustaining the spark that Yavuz Sezer's tragically shortcut life brought to our lives, and to keeping his intellectual legacy alive and to growing it by passing it along on to new people. Our aim is to gather each year, and although we are virtual this year, we wholeheartedly hope to be in person as of next year, to gather each year around one of the 3 main subjects that Yavuz Sezer dedicated his life to: architectural history, urban history, and last but not least, book history. On that note, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Professor Roger Chartier, who has kindly agreed to deliver the inaugural lecture of the series. Professor Chartier, quite likely, as Mehmet has expressed, needs no introduction, but I try to say a few words. Roger Chartier is an emeritus professor at the Collège de France and at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and the Annenberg Visiting Professor in History at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on the histories of written culture, book, and reading in early modern Europe. His publications are too numerous to count. He actually has published hundreds of works in the form of monographs, articles, and edited books. So please excuse me for giving a very selective account here. His books include one in translation, Textual Mobility in Early Modern Europe, which is forthcoming in 2022. Inscription and Erasure, Literature and Written Culture from the 11th to the 18th century, published in 2007. Forms and Meanings, Text, Performances, and Audiences from Codex to Computer. The Order of Books, which I just mentioned, Readers, Authors, and Libraries in Europe between the 14th and 18th centuries, published in 1994. The Cultural Origins of the French Revolution, published in 1991. And The Cultural Uses of Print in Early Modern France, 1987. 3 of his books have been translated into Turkish, and we do genuinely hope that more will be translated for readers in Turkey. These books include the translation of On the Edge of the Cliff, History, Language, and Practices, which is translated as Yeniden Geçmiş, Tarih, Yazılı Kültür, Toplum. The Sociologist and the Historian, which is his conversation with Pierre Bourdieu, which is translated as Sosyolog ve Tarihçi. And finally, The History of Private Life that he co-edited with Philippe Ariès and Georges Duby, translated as Özel Hayatın Tarihi. Through these monographs and many other academic articles, Professor Chartier studies fundamentally transformed the history of reading. In one of the early articles in which he laid out his methodology, entitled Urban Reading Practices, published in 1984, he criticized the predominantly statistical approach to book culture that prevailed at the time and that relied on data such as the number and the distribution of books exclusively for an understanding of reading patterns. Instead of this simplistic approach, Professor Chartier offered a total history of reading, an approach that took into account both the material settings and social practices of reading in a complete and exhaustive manner. For him, a history of reading had to address all of these factors, including attention to material conditions surrounding books and readers, either their production process or spaces of reading, even furnitures of reading. Attention should also need to pay to the social practices surrounding the production and reading of a text. And this approach did not only lead to a reassessment of the relationship between orality and written culture, but above all, transformed and expanded the definition of reading. What is the act of reading and what constitutes the act of reading? Moreover, Professor Chartier showed reading to be an active, creative, and even disruptive action at times, rather than a passive consumption of a fixed meaning created and intended by the author. His work remained in close conversation with theoretical analysis of reading. He historicized and tested the limits of well-known theories on reading, such as the theory of reading as poaching, as forwarded by the Sartre, the concept of interpretive communities as the locus of meaning, as forwarded by Stanley Fish, and his work also closely engaged with the conceptualization of reading as appropriation, as found in the work of Foucault and others. Finally, he considered book ownership in relation to specific habitus or social zones and explored the relationship of such patterns with notions of civility and urbanity. And this was an important research agenda that Yavuz Sezer explored in his dissertation within the Ottoman context, namely the connection between book ownership, library patronage, reading habits, and civility or adab. This new, theoretically insightful history of reading pioneered by Professor Chartier has transformed the study of Ottoman cultural intellectual history in the last 2 decades. Dr. Yavuz Sezer's work is one of the finest examples of this new mode of scholarship that has been directly inspired by Professor Chartier's scholarship. It is with these intellectual connections in mind that we are particularly pleased to have Professor Chartier as our inaugural speaker for this lecture series. So Professor Chartier, thank you for being with us today. And I'm sure our viewers are getting impatient to listen to your talk. So without further ado, I'd like to leave the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind invitation and also for this very generous presentation, introduction. I am deeply honored and moved to deliver today this inaugural lecture of the series commemorating Dr. Yavuz Sezer's work. I read his doctoral dissertation that, as you say, will be published soon, I hope so, by Edinburgh University Press. And I was deeply impressed by his rigorous and inventive scholarship. I would like to dedicate to his memory my lecture today. This lecture will be addressing 2 questions. First, I would like to analyze how reading was conceived of by literary criticism, sociology of practices, and cultural history. And what is at stake, as you say, in such a perspective, is a conception or conceptualization of the relationship between the text and the reader, and the process through which meaning is constructed. Whence the fundamental importance of the notion of materiality of the text. Secondly, in the second part of this talk, I would like to recall some questions raised by the history of reading that can suggest perhaps some reflection about the reading practices in our own times. I shall examine the conquest of silent reading at the expenses of reading out loud for the other or for oneself, the practices of reading as writing, and finally, the so-called reading revolution of the 18th century and its relation with the construction of a political public sphere. After 1949, for the structural and semiotic perspectives that inspired both English and American new criticism and French nouvelle critique, the meaning of the text was considered as produced by language. When the critique of the authorial intention and the primacy given to the internal, impersonal functioning of language in the text itself. As wrote Wimsatt and Beardsley in their famous article, The Intentional Fallacy, published in 1946 in the Sewanee Review, I quote, "There is a difference between internal and external evidence for the meaning of a poem. And the paradox is that what is internal is also public. It is discovered through the semantics and syntax of a poem, through our habitual knowledge of the language, through grammars, dictionaries, and all the literature which is a source of a dictionary. In general, through all that makes a language and culture. While what is external is private and idiosyncratic, not a part of the work as a linguistic fact. Consequently, literary criticism must always prefer the internal evidence because, I quote, a poem can be only through its meaning, since its medium is words. By refusing the romantic internationalist assumption, new critics did not only deny any relevance to the biography of the author, to the circumstances of writing, but also they did not give any importance to the readers in their actual diversity, since the meaning, as exposed by the critic, is the result of a linguistic machinery. Without authors, without readers, the texts were also thought of without any materiality. Such a perspective echoed in literary criticism, in contemporary literary criticism, the old discourses that postulated the existence of works always identical to themselves, independently of their material forms or interpretive appropriations. Thus, the Neoplatonist opposition between the purity of the idea and its corruption by the matter, or the justification of the copyright that established the author's property on a text considered as always the same, whatever the form of its publication may be, or finally, the triumph of a post-Kantian aesthetics that considers works independently of their different and successive embodiments. Paradoxically, the two critical approaches that after the Second World War paid the most sustained attention to the material modalities of the inscription of the written word have reinforced rather than opposed this process of textual abstraction. The new bibliography, pioneered by Pollard, McKenzie, Gregg, and continued by Trace and Bowers, has mobilized the rigorous study of the various states of the same work, editions, issues, copies, in order to find an ideal text, purified of the alterations inflicted to it through the process of publication. A text supposedly identical to the text written, dictated, or dreamt of by its author. Hence, within physical bibliography, a discipline dedicated almost exclusively to the comparison of printed objects, the obsession for the lost manuscripts, and the radical distinction between the essentials of the work, always the same, and the accidents that have deformed or corrupted its meaning. In such a perspective, the readers did not play any role beyond the possible misunderstanding of the authorial manuscript by scribes, copy editors, or compositors. For its part, the deconstructionist approach à la Derrida has forcefully insisted on the materiality of writing and on the different forms of inscription of the language. But in its effort to abolish or to reframe the most immediate opposition between orality and writing, between speech acts and the reproducibility of the written word, such an approach has proposed encompassing conceptual categories, archive writing, iterability, that divert from the possible perception of the effects produced by the empirical differences that these categories are erasing. Consequently, the instability of the meaning of the text is located within the contradictory relations between words that give to text their undecidability and not within the diversity of actual readers' practices. In reaction against this effacement of the reader within the text, several approaches have considered since the 70s in the 20th century the production of meaning as constructed by the inventive, dynamic relationship that exists between readers and text. The project took on diverse forms within literary criticism and cultural sociology, but the main issue was always the same: how to free the readers both from the authorial intention or from the tyranny of the linguistic machinery without falling into an endless inventory of subjective readings. I would like to stress 5 of the propositions that address such a challenge, and you mentioned at least 3 of them already. First, in the theory of poetics of reception, it is a concept of Erwartungshorizont, horizon of expectation, that must overcome the difficulty. In its definition proposed by Hans Robert Yavuz in his seminal article, Literary History as a Challenge to Literary Theory, published in 1970, the notion designates the aesthetic and intellectual categories that govern the reception and interpretation of the works by their readers. For Yavuz, this horizon of expectation is composed by 3 fundamental elements. I quote, "This frame of reference for each work develops in the historical moment of its appearance from a previous understanding of the genre, from the form and themes of already familiar works, and from the contrast between poetic and practical language. Breaking with the idea of, I quote again, objective meaning, determined once and for all, and directly open to the interpreter at any time, and of course, the dialectic relationship between the works and their readers allows to understand why some works immediately fulfilled what their readers expected, and why some other works, for example, Don Quixote or Madame Bovary, quoted by Yavuz, challenged previous categories, previous horizon of expectation, and were able to impose what he called a horizon change. The reader response theory, for its part, focused on the dynamic interaction between the structure, the motive of the text, and the individual reader's work of interpretation and appropriation. In this perspective, reading must be understood as a response to the text. As wrote Wolfgang Iser in his book, The Act of Reading, published in 1978, I quote Iser, aesthetic response is to be analyzed in terms of a dialectic relationship between text, reader, and their interaction. It is called aesthetic response because, although it is brought about by the text, it brings into play the imaginative and perceptive faculties of the reader in order to make him adjust and even differentiate his own focus. And Iser concluded, this approach implies that this book, his own book, Iser's book, is to be regarded as a theory of aesthetic response, Wirkungstheorie, and not as a theory of aesthetics of reception, Rezeptionstheorie à la Yavuz. A theory of response, said Iser, as its roots in the text, a theory of reception arises from a history of readers' judgments. The phenomenology of reading and the theory of interaction are proposed by Iser for refusing, I quote, the current theories which give the impression that texts automatically imprint themselves on the reader's mind. His starting point is, quote, the fact that the linguistic signs and structure of the text exhaust their function in triggering, developing acts of comprehension. This is tantamount to say that these acts, though set in motion by the text, defy total control by the text itself, and indeed, it is the very lack of control that forms the basis for the creative side of reading, end of quote. Whence, for example, the stimulation of the reader's imagination by the gaps or the contradiction within a text. The first one, the gaps, because, I quote, induce the reader to perform basic operation within the text. The second one, the contradiction, because the reader, I quote, is guided to adopt a position in relation with the text. Third perspective, for constructing the inventive capacity of reading without postulating innumerable arbitrary interpretation, Stanley Fish, as you said, proposed in 1980 in his book, Is There a Text in This Class?, the category of interpretive communities. Coined for avoiding either the tyranny of the text or the radical solipsism of reading, and for resolving, I quote, the dilemma between the champions of the text and the champions of the reader, the notion coined by Stanley Fish defined interpretive categories and strategies as not universal, but neither totally idiosyncratic. For Fish, for example, I quote, the act of recognizing literature is not constrained by something in the text, nor does it issue from an independent and arbitrary will. Rather, it proceeds from a collective decision as to what will count as literature, a decision that will be enforced only so long a community of readers or believers continues to abide by it. The notion of interpretive community must allow to link text and readers, the evidence of meaning and the experience of reading. I quote again, an interpretive community is not objective because as a bundle of interests, of particular purposes and goals, its perspective is interested rather than neutral. But by the very same reasoning, the meanings and texts produced by an interpretive community are not subjective because they did not proceed from an isolated individual, but from a public and conventional point of view. For Stanley Fish, the interpretive strategies displayed by the different communities of readers are at the same time decisive for the construction of the meaning of what it is read, and previous to the act of reading, because they imply norms and values that govern for each reading community its relation with literature and more broadly with the written culture. I quote, "Interpretive strategies are not put into execution after reading. They are the shape of reading. And because they are the shape of reading, they give text their shape, making them rather than, as is usually assumed, arising from them." It seems to me that we could consider it as close to the perspective proposed by Yavuz, Sezer, and Fish what Barthes wrote in La Mort de l'Auteur, an essay first published in English in Aspen magazine in 1967 and published in French the following year in the review Monteil. Barthes defined reading as the position, the place where is constructed a meaning that evades the author's control or intention. I quote Barthes, "A text consists of multiple writings, issuing from several cultures and entering into dialogue which is of, into parody, into contestation. But there is one place where this multiplicity is collected, united, and this place is not the author, as we have hitherto said it was, but the reader. The reader is the very space in which are inscribed, without any being lost, all the citations a writing consists of. The unity of a text is not in its origin, it is in its destination." Whence, as you know, the famous and dramatic conclusion, I quote, "The birth of the reader must be ransomed by the death of the author." Last but not least, Michel de Certeau's famous metaphor of reading as poaching, braconnage. For de Certeau, reading is not a passive consumption, but an active production. I quote the practice of everyday life. "Reading an image or text seems to constitute the maximal development of a passivity assumed to characterize a consumer who is conceived as a warrior in a showbiz society. In reality, the activity of reading has, on the contrary, all the characteristics of a silent production. The drift across the page, the metamorphosis of the text effected by the wandering eyes of the reader, the improvisation and expectation of meanings inferred from a few words, leaps over written spaces in ephemeral dances. The reader insinuates into another person's text the ruses of pleasure and appropriation. He poaches on it, is transported into it, pluralizes himself in it." For de Certeau, reading is a paradigmatic example of the ways of operating these art de faire, which are tactics considered as the art of the weak that appropriate what is imposed by the strategies of the various powers, either economic or cultural. The place of a tactic belongs to the other. A tactic insinuates itself into the other's place, fragmentarily, without taking it over its entirety, without being able to keep it at distance. In this sense, it is in this sense that readers are poachers or travelers. And a superb quotation by de Certeau, "Far from being writers, founder of their own place, heirs of the peasants of earlier ages now walking on the soil of language, diggers of wells, builders of houses, readers are travelers. They move across lands belonging to someone else, like nomads poaching their way across fields they did not write." like Bard's death of the author, it is such a poaching that produces the meaning or even the existence of any text. Quote again de Certeau, whether it is question of newspapers or Proust, the text has a meaning only through its readers. It changes along with them. It is ordered in accord with codes of perception that it does not control. It becomes a text only in its relation to the exteriority of the reader by an interplay of implications and ruses between two sorts of expectation in combination, the expectations that organize a readable space, a literality, and the expectation that organizes a procedure for the actualization of the work reading. Clearly, all these approaches, Yavuz, Sezer, Fish, Barthes, de Certeau, have assigned an essential role to reading in the construction of the meaning, and have considered that interpretation was a dialogical, a dynamical act of appropriation. But they become, at their turn, the targets of critiques developed either by the sociology of text as defined by Don McKenzie or by cultural history. First of all, they consider text as if they existed in and of themselves. Excuse me, I forgot to suppress this phone. The targets of critique developed by sociology of text, by cultural history. First of all, as I said, they consider the text as they existed in and of themselves, outside of the objects and voices that transmit them. But we must recognize that the forms which make text to be read or to be listened to also contribute to the construction of their meaning. And when the title of this lecture, Forms, Effect, Meaning, it was written by McKenzie in his Hispanidzi lecture in 1985. Forms, Effect, Meaning. It is the reason why disciplines dedicated to rigorous description of objects that carry the text have regained a fundamental importance in the last decades, as paleography and codicology transformed into an ambitious history of writing culture by Armando Petrucci, or bibliography converted into sociology of text by Don McKenzie. Secondly, critical approaches that have considered reading as a reception or as a response have implicitly universalized the process of reading as if it was always a similar act of which circumstances and modalities do not matter. They have erased the historical and social determinations of reading practices and of reading itself. Barthes did it by affirming that, I quote, the reader is a man without history, without biography, without psychology. He is only that someone who holds gathered into a single field all the path of which the text is constituted. Yavuz did it by presupposing that exists a, quote, transsubjective horizon of understanding that determines the impact of the text. And Fish did it by reducing the characteristic of the interpretive communities to their sole unique hermeneutic strategies. Against such an obliteration of the historicity of the reader, the history or the sociology of reading shows that the meaning attributed to the text are produced by the capacities, conventions, practices proper to the communities that constitute simultaneously or successively their different readerships. Against the presupposition of the invariance of reading, whatever the genre it appropriates, or the circumstances of the practice. Pierre Bourdieu recalled in his essay, Lecture, Lecteur, Lettré, Littérature, an essay published in English in the book In Other Words, that, and I quote Bourdieu, to ask about the conditions under which reading is possible is to ask about the social condition under which the situation in which one reads is possible. And it's, follow Bourdieu, also to ask about the social conditions governing the production of lectores. And he used this medieval word in the sense of learned, professional, academic readers, for example, the literary critics or the historians. And Bourdieu follows, one of the illusions of the lector is to forget his own social condition of production, to universalize unconsciously the condition under which his or her reading is possible. Consequently, one of the principal tasks of literary criticism or cultural history consists rightly of dissipating such an illusion. It must hold the world of the text to be a world of objects and performances, and the world of the readers to be the world of the communities to which this reader belong, communities that are defined not only by their hermeneutic strategies, but also by a series of social, cultural, and economic characteristics. As such are gender, age, profession, religion, and so on. It is the reason why McKenzie gave a fundamental importance to reading in his sociology of text. He agrees with the idea according to which a text truly comes to life only when readers make it their own. But he gives to the axiom a fundamental historical dimension. I quote McKenzie, new readers make new texts, and their new meaning of the text are a function of their new forms. These remarks indicated the double set of variations in readers' abilities, expectations, and habits in the material forms in which texts are presented for reading that any approach must take into account if it aims to reconstruct how readers produced and produce meaning when they read or read a text. It is the way to give materiality to the readable space mentioned by de Certeau, and to locate reading understood as the actualization of the work, de Certeau again, within its historical and socio-cultural conditions of possibility. The notion of materiality of the text becomes fundamental in such a perspective. It was introduced by Margherita Di Grazia and Peter Stalibras in a seminal article published in Shakespeare's Quarterly in 1993, The Materiality of the Shakespearean Text. Their critique challenged two dominant modes of reading Shakespeare at the time, formalism and historicism. I quote, both forms of criticism has taken for granted the identity of their object without realizing how that assumption subverts their very approach. Formalists, it's always De Grazia and Saliba speaking, formalists call for exacting attention to the minutiae of literary language without giving thought to the printing houses' practices that have in modern editions produced them. Historicists, tracing in Shakespeare's work the discursive structure specific to the late 16th and early 17th century, have ignored the extent to which this structure are 18th century constructs. Their first target was a new criticism that considered text as linguistic structure that produce meaning independently of the material inscription of language. And the second target was a new historicism that focused rightly on the negotiation between the work of literature and the social world, and on the aesthetic and symbolic appropriation by the works themselves of ordinary objects transformed into props on the stage, languages, ritual or daily practices, but without historicizing the text itself. That is to say, the unstable relation between the work and its multiple texts. Even if the historicity of reading practices was not the main issue of this twofold critique, it was implied by the idea according to which no text exists outside of the material form that offers it for reading, or outside of the circumstances in which it is read. As wrote Roger Stoddard, the librarian at Harvard, authors do not write books. Books are not written at all. They are manufactured by scribes and other artisans, by mechanics and other engineers, and by printing presses and other machines. Paying attention to the material embodiment of the text that result from editorial decision, technical operation, labor practices, is a powerful way for understanding how, in different times, readers have appropriately differently the work they have read. David Kasten, a Shakespearean scholar, has characterized the view that the work transcends all its possible material incarnation as Platonic, in contrast to the pragmatic view according to which no text exists apart from the material forms and cultural practices through which it is read or listened to. This contradictory perception of the text divide, as you know, both literary criticism and editorial practices. Opposing views who attempt to restore the author's ideal text by repairing the wounds inflicted to it by scribes and compositor typesetters. To those who argue that we must respect, understand the irreducible diversity of the different states of the same, with quotation mark, work. A similar tension between the immateriality of the work and the materiality of its text characterize also, it seems to me, the relation between readers and the books they appropriate. In a lecture delivered in 1978, El Libro, the book, Jorge Luis Borges said, "One day I thought I would write a history of the book." But he added immediately, "I am not interested in the physical aspect of the books, but in the various ways in which books have been regarded." For Borges, thus, the material form of the text is irrelevant. What counts is how the book, meaning the work independently of its embodiment, was regarded or often disregarded in comparison with the winged and sacred spoken word. Borges, in other words, took the Platonic view. But when the same Borges dictated his autobiography to Norman Thomas Di Giovanni, a biography published in the New Yorker in 1970, he spoke quite differently about one of the books that have shaped his life, Don Quixote de la Mancha. Now, he vividly recalled the specific object that he had held in his hands and read. I quote, "I still remember the red bindings with gilt title of the Garnier edition. Eventually, after my father's library was broken up and I read Don Quixote in another edition, I had the feeling that it was not the real Don Quixote. Later, a friend obtained for me a Garnier copy with the same engravings, the same footnotes, the same errata. For me, all these things were part of the book. In my mind, this was the real Don Quixote." For Borges, the real Don Quixote took the irreducible material form of an illustrated edition that had been imported from France, the editions that he has read as a young boy. The Platonic principle is of little weight compared with the pragmatic return of memory. Borges' contradictory views suggest that the contrast between Platonism and pragmatism is perhaps missing a decisive element for any reading experience. On the one hand, a text, whatever it may be, becomes always available to be read or heard only in some particular material form. Depending on time and genre, the variation between these different states of the same work can involve, separately or together, the modalities of its inscription and publication, the spelling of the word, the layout of the page, the presence or absence of illustration or textual variants. On the other hand, multiple agencies, philosophical, aesthetic, juridical, have attempted to reduce this diversity by postulating the existence of a work considered as remaining always the same, regardless of its textual or material variations. They construct an ideal text which readers recognize in each of its different states, Madame Bovary or Don Quixote de la Mancha. What is important, perhaps, is not to try to resolve this irreducible tension, but rather to identify the way in which it was thought of at various moments and by different communities of readers. This project was a founding principle for the development of the history of reading practices. For illustrating the use that historians have made of this series of reflections about reading developed by literary criticism, sociology, or cultural history, I would like to stress four fundamental transformations of reading practices in the European Western societies between the late Middle Ages and modern times. And by doing this, to suggest sometimes some topics for questioning our contemporary digital era. The first transformation considers reading as a corporeal experience related to the voice and to the body. Reading, as we know, has become a silent and visual appropriation of the text read. Even if the chronology of such a mutation can be discussed, and I shall do this briefly, the thesis that emphasizes the progressive diffusion of silent reading designate accurately a profound mutation of the experience of reading. Michel de Certeau underlined the effect of such transformation. I quote, "To read without uttering the words aloud, or at least mumbling them, is a modern experience unknown for millennia. In earlier times, the reader interiorized the text. He made his voice the body of the other. He was its actor. Today," added de Certeau, "the text no longer imposes its own rhythm on the subject. It no longer manifests itself through the reader's voice. This withdrawal of the body, which is a condition of autonomy, is a distancing of the text. It is a reader's habeas corpus." For Paul Sanger, the conquest of such a silent reading was a result of gradual advances of the possibility of the practice. First, in the monasteries of the early Middle Ages, then during the 12th and 13th centuries in the schools and the universities, and finally, in the last century of the Middle Ages and beginning of the early modern times among the lay aristocracy. Later, the capacity of reading visually and silently without the necessity to oralize the text in order to understand it was expected from all the readers, even the most popular. Armando Petrucci challenged this diachronic model by stressing that several modalities of reading coexisted already in the medieval period and were practiced either by different readers or by a single reader, but in different circumstances. This coexistence was a coexistence between silent reading, already present, reading in a loud voice called ruminatio, which served as an aid for meditation and an instrument for memorization of the text, and finally, reading out loud, which was rather like liturgical recitation or chanting. What remains, however, in this discrepancy is the fact that the progresses of literacies defined as a universal norm the capacity for reader to read without the need to listen to the text. As a consequence, the necessity of reading aloud for understanding a text became characteristic of illiteracy. And it's the case in the sociological inquiries today. Silent reading initiated a relation with the written word that was more secretive and that allowed rapid, skilled reading that could decipher the multiple relationships set up between the discourse and its glosses, commentaries, tables, or indexes. If the history of reading in the longue durée is this history of the conquest of the reader's freedom, the modality of reading, vocal or visual, is not the only transformation of reading understood as a bodily experience. Reading a scroll in the antiquity required the mobilization of the entire body. The scroll must be held by the two hands of the reader, who cannot write when he or she is reading. The invention and diffusion of the codex between the 2nd and 4th century of the Christian era freed the reader, who is no more obliged to hold the book and can write at the same time he or she is reading. The reader can take distance in relation to the book, put on a desk or on a pulpit. In the 18th century, the multiplication of the small formats, octavo in 12, in 16, allowed even a closer familiarity of the body with the books and new practices of reading, reading while walking, reading in the garden, reading in the countryside, reading in the bed, and so on. What does happen to the relationship between the body and the text in the digital world when it is mediated by a keyboard, or when the reader's fingers move directly the text on the screen? A second question concerned reading as writing. During the Renaissance, reading practices cannot be separated from the dominant intellectual technique of commonplacing. To read was to extract from the text read historical or natural facts, rhetorical models, or mainly sentences, sententiae, that are sublime universal truths. The reader must mark them in the book itself, then he must copy them in a commonplace notebook in order to reuse them, this quotation, these sentences, in his own or her own compositions. Since the 18th century on, with the decline of this technique of commonplacing, marginal annotations acquired a different meaning. They indicated the intellectual or sentimental reactions or responses of the reader, who enter into a personal dialogue with the text in the margin of the text. This example shows how morphological similarities to write marginalia in a book can acquire very different cultural and intellectual meaning according to what is expected from reading. Today, such a discontinuity exists, even within apparent continuities. Digital reading is a segmented reading, attached to the fragments more than to the totality of the work. Is this not, by that token, similar to the practices allowed and encouraged by the codex? It is the codex, manuscript and after printed, and not the screen, that invited the reader to skip pages or passages, to live through the book, to read as Montaigne did, as Saul et Gambad, by skips and jumps. It is the codex and not the screen that invited to compare passages in the same book, as did the typological reading of the Bible, or to indicate, extract, and copy the quotation as demanded by humanistic technique of commonplacing. More broadly, written culture and reading experiences have been largely and durably constructed on the basis of the appropriation of fragments gathered into the collection of commonplaces, the anthologies of extract, called often in French in the 18th century, esprit, or pedagogical morceaux choisis. It is true, but it seems to me that the fragmentation of the text and the discontinuity of reading do not have the same meaning when they are accompanied by the perception of the textual totality made visible by the materiality of the book, and when the screen no longer displays the limits and coherence of the work from which the fragments are extracted. When the fundamental question that springs from this radical rupture, how are we to preserve the ways of reading that construct the meaning on the basis of the coexistence of various texts in a single and particular object, a book, a journal, a newspaper, when the modes of transmission of the written word imposes a logic in which every fragment has no other context than a thematic one, and perhaps cannot be more considered as a fragment if the totality from which it is extracted is no more perceived. What is at stake here is no less than the dissociation between, on the one hand, the categories that are founded an order of discourse, an order of the books, or of reading on the author's name, the identity of the works, and the notion of intellectual and literary property, and on the other hand, the erasure of these criteria to the profit of a new way of reading text and perceiving the written word as a polyphonic and palimpsest discourse in which the reader transforms into reader, recompose in total liberty, mobile and authorless fragments. Another topic discussed by the historian was the question of the reading revolution in the 18th century. There are two aspects to this question. The first is historical and considered the early modern dinosaurs or debates about the effect of the captivation of the readers by the text they read. Using in the 18th century the categories drawn from sensualist psychology, these dinosaurs reformulated all the denunciation of the perils faced by reader or works of fiction. In Golden Age Castile, for example, three elements were strongly linked. Repeated mention of Plato's expulsion of the poets from the Republic, the use of the vocabulary of rapture, embelezar, maravillar, encantar, to characterize the reader's denial of the real world when he or she is captured by the fable. And finally, the idea according to which silent, solitary reading at the expense of reading out loud to the other or for oneself encourage the confusion and the fusion between the world of the text and the world of the readers. In the 18th century, the discourse was deeply medicalized. A pathology was constructed in which excessive reading figured either as an individual illness or as a collective epidemic. Uncontrolled reading was considered dangerous because it combined physical immobility with excitement of the imagination. This led for the physicians of the 18th century to ills of the worst sort: engorgement of the stomach and intestine, derangement of the nerves, physical exhaustion. Professional readers namely men of letters, were the most vulnerable to such disorders that could lead to their characteristic affliction, hypochondria. Furthermore, solitary reading is thought of as leading to the rejection of reality and to a preference given to the chimerical. Thus, excessive reading was linked to solitary pleasures. Both practices resulted in the same symptoms: pallor, anxiety, prostration. The danger was most severe when the reading was reading of a gallant, libertine, or erotic novel, and when the reader was a woman withdrawn into solitude. And a lot of paintings are depicting this troubled periods. It might be objected, of course, that the generous emotion spurred by the reading of Richardson's novel, by Rousseau's novels, had nothing in common with the lascivious rapture denounced by physicians. But what is interesting is the fact that in both cases, reading was conceived of in the 18th century in terms of its physical effects. The somatization of a practice traditionally described in terms of intellectual or moral categories was perhaps the sign of a major mutation, if not necessarily in all the behavior, at least in the representations. A second aspect of the 18th century revolution in reading question, reading and revolution, or reading revolution question, is historiographical. It is connected with the hypothetical opposition between a traditional form of reading called intensive and a modern form appear in the 18th century characterized as extensive. According to this dichotomy, first proposed by Rolf Engelsing in 1970, the intensive reader of the first century of the early modern period faced a limited corpus of text, which were read and reread, memorized, recited, listened to, and learned by heart, and finally transmitted from generation to generation. This type of reading, called intensive, was deeply imbued with sacrality and was subjected the reader to the authority of the text. The extensive reader who first appeared in the 18th century was quite different, or she read numerous printed texts, many of them new and ephemeral, and he or she consumed them avidly, rapidly. His gaze was detached and critical. Thus, a communal and respectful relation to the written word gave way to a more irreverent and casual mode of reading. Historians' reaction to this thesis have varied. Without doubt, Robert Darnton has been the most skeptical that such a revolution ever took place. I quote Darnton: although tastes changed and the reading public expanded, the experience of reading was not transformed. It became more secular, more varied, but no less intense. It did not undergo a revolution. Historians have discovered and dismissed so many hidden revolutions of the past that the reading revolution might be safely ignored. Critique of the expression, but sensitive to the mutations of the practices, Hans Erich Bödecker offer a more nuanced judgment. I quote: although it is possible to doubt aspects of the reading revolution hypothesis, a transformation of reading habits did indeed take place at the end of the 18th century. And Reinhard Whitman is still more categorical. I quote: was there a reading revolution at the end of the 18th century? In spite of all the limitations, the answer to the question is yes. Thus, it would seem worthwhile, perhaps, to return briefly to this debate. The reading of Richardson's novel, Rousseau's novel Héloïse, Goethe's Suffering of Young Werther, really radically undermines Engelsing's proposed chronology. The 18th century novel took hold of its readers, captivated him or her, governed his or her thoughts and actions. The novel was read and reread, quoted, recited. The reader was invaded by the text. And through identification with the heroes of the novel, he began, or she began, to decipher his or her own life in the mirror of fiction. This particularly intense and intensive form of reading engaged the entire sensibility of readers, male and female alike, who could not restrain their emotion, their feeling, and their tears. This leads us to qualify or refuse a too sharp opposition between the two styles of reading, the second one supposedly following and supplanting the first one. Is that enough, however, to invalidate the history or the idea of a reading revolution in the 18th century? Perhaps not. Throughout enlightened Europe, profound changes transformed the printed production and the condition of access to books, despite the stability of typographic technology and labor and the stability of the censorship. Everywhere, the growing supply of books, the secularization of the title offered, the circulation of clandestine prohibited text, the proliferation of periodicals, the triumph, as I said, of small formats, and the proliferation of reading societies and circulating libraries that made it possible to read books and periodicals without buying them, imposed new reading practices. For the most literate readers of both sexes, the possibilities of reading seems to expand, opening the way to a variety of practices and experiences associated with different times, place, and genre. Each reader was thus, at one time or another, either intensive or extensive, absorbed or casual, studious or amused. Why not assume that the 18th century reading revolution consisted precisely, at least for the elite, in this new capacity to read in a variety of ways? Such a formulation explains the complex nature of this revolution, which could be characterized not by general adoption of a new hegemonic and distinctive style of reading, supposedly extensive, but rather by the possible recourse to a variety of practices, some of which were old and others new. Yavuz Sezer books on the multiplication of library in the 18th century Ottoman Empire leads to a similar conclusion about the widening of the reading public, the acceleration of book production, and the easiest access to a great variety of genres. His work that stresses, I quote, the urge for books and the growing demand for bookish culture suggests two deep reappraisals. First, we must locate in a broader geographical framework the debate about 18th century reading revolution, which was not limited to Western Europe only. And secondly, we must consider that typography is not a necessity for the existence of a wide reading culture. It was true in the East, in China and Korea, where the dominant print culture ignored both mobile types and printing presses and used xylography. And it was the case in the Ottoman Empire, where the circulation of books and the creation of libraries took place within a manuscript culture, without printing, if we accept the very few editions printed in Muteferica's workshop. Last point, and rapidly. A last tension that leads to the present is a tension between solitary reading and reading in society. If reading was often described as a withdrawal of the reader from the constraint of the family, the office, or the city, according Modell's famous perspective, reading aloud for the others was also a dominant practice in multiple forms of sociability in early modern time. Either forms of sociability based on familial ties or on institutional context, university, college, academies, literary society, or even more spontaneous forms of sociability, reading for the other during the travel, in the street, in the squares, in the garden. In the 18th century, both practices, reading, solitary reading and reading in society, can sustain the construction of a public sphere, thought of either as based on the oral delivery of speeches and oral exchanges, as in the city of the antiquity, or as defined by the circulation of ideas and opinion resulting thanks to private reading and written communication. It is a participation of the reading public into the discussion about judgments and reforms that define for Kant the public and critical use of their reason by private individuals. In Was ist Aufklärung, What is Enlightenment, Kant wrote, by public use of one's reason, I mean the use which a man as scholar, Gelehrte, makes of it before the reading public. Kant proposed a new articulation of the relation between the public and the private, not only by equating the public exercise of reason with judgment produced and communicated by individuals acting as scholars in their quality of learned men, but also by defining the public sphere as a sphere of the universal and the private as a domain of the particular of domestic interest, which may even be those of a church or a state. It is a reason why Kant associated the public use of one's reason with the circulation and reading of written text and not with the new forms of intellectual sociability such as literary societies, Masonic lodges, clubs, or coffee houses. Because all these forms of sociability retain something of a domestic congregation, that is to say, something of the private. Kant did not define the public in reference to the ideal of the antique city, which presupposed the physical proximity and common deliberation of all the members of the body politic. For him, only written communication and a reading public were possible figures of the universal. Does the reading public in the digital era construct such a political public sphere, or does it betray Kant's aspiration? And in our digital age, is such a public critical, free, or manipulated and alienated? I leave the answers to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chartier, for an amazing, very rich talk. We learned a lot about history of reading, and we had a lot of thought-provoking insights and questions from you. Thank you so much on behalf of everyone. I'd like to announce that the audience members, you can freely write your questions on YouTube, and I will be happy to ask your questions to Professor Chartier if you have any. So while we're waiting for people to write in the chat of questions, Professor Chartier, if I may, I'd like to start the conversation with a few questions or thoughts that I wanted to hear more about from your talk. I mean, you gave us all these theories about reading as poaching, reading as appropriation, but you also mentioned another approach of reading as negotiation, which is, as far as I understand, this is a concept of negotiation between the author and the reader, and it's also negotiation between the intermediaries between the author and the reader, right? For a manuscript culture, it could be someone who wrote a commentary. For Print counter, it could be someone who ran a print shop, but we have these intermediaries who are trying to guide, control the ways in which readers understand texts. So I was wondering how you approach this framework of negotiation as opposed to appropriation, because negotiation has two agents, right? And appropriation has one agent, which is the reader. So I wanted to hear more your reflections on two ways of framing the act of reading.
Very important and interesting point. Negotiation in the talk was understood in relation with literary tradition, which has used more than others this term, that is to say the new historicism. In Greenblatt's work, of course, negotiation and transaction are a key concept. Even it's a subtitle of the title of the book, Shakespearean negotiations. And so in this first perspective, the negotiation are a form of appropriation by the author of a play, or more broadly by all the people involved into the theatrical performance of materials coming from the society. It could be discourse, it could be rituals, it could be everyday practices, it could be included material object put on the stage as props. So in this case, the negotiation has not necessarily the implication you introduce, because of course it's a form of appropriation of what is in the mind of the spectators, but at the same time transformed by the aesthetic act. But you are right, we could use the term outside of this context of the dramatic creation, and for thinking about the practices of reading, but in a sense by restoring in the term what is missing in Greenblatt's definition, that is to say the negotiation imply discussion, exchange, dialogue, contradiction, and to look at all the moments or places in the written culture in which such negotiation in a fundamental sense of interaction is present between different individuals. And you mentioned one, could be the printing shop or the shop of the bookseller, in which you could have, like in Renaissance, Venice, the author, because we have to recall that if an author wants to control the process of publication of his work, and particularly the correction of the proofs, he has to be present in the printing shop. It's not like in 19th or 20th century when the proofs were sent by mail to the author. Here, there is no possibility to immobilize during too long a time the types. So you have to make the correction of the proof on the spot. And so in this, for example, Aldus Manutius workshop, the presence of the author, the presence of the editor, corrector of the text, the presence of the master printer, or the bookseller as publisher, and finally, the presence of some readers who are buying, looking at the book. So it would be one of the situation. Another situation for this negotiation will be all this form of reading in society, in which the sociabilities of reading, when you have exchanges which are related to the reading or listening to the same text. And in the 18th century, all this form from the most spontaneous form of reading the same book at the same time in a small sociability, a description by Diderot of reading of Richardson in this context, or some paintings which show, I remember one by De Troyes, the reading of Molière. Someone is reading the play, and around there are 7 or 8 men and women, and we can imagine that they stop, they discuss, they exchange. So, and the same thing in a more institutional form in the book club or Lesegesellschaften in Germany, when in a place open to readers who are no more obliged to buy the book, but just to subscribe to the club, we can imagine also a form of interaction and a form of a collective appreciation and judgment about the book read by the different members of such book clubs or cabinet littéraire in French or Lesegesellschaften in Germany. So it's a very interesting suggestion to look at this place of actual negotiation around the meaning of the text.
Yeah, no, thank you for that answer. And maybe there are questions from the audience, but I'm going to abuse my position as moderator and ask a follow-up question, if you don't mind. Because fundamentally, you know, I work like Yavuz did on manuscripts, and that's a different culture of readers leaving notes and writers making marginalia to guide readers, and maybe other copyists making marginalia. So the page presents a lot of evidence of this negotiation between different types of reading in a manuscript culture, which I always find very interesting. So I was wondering if you, and I know that after you published on print culture, you have also written a little bit about the continuity of manuscript culture into the print age. So I wanted to see if you have any comparisons between those two cultures in terms of reading practices or you know, our ability to follow reading practices in manuscript versus print culture. And more specifically, maybe a question could be, it's often assumed that a manuscript text is more of an open text than a print text, which is a finished text. This is something we hear a lot in book history. Do you agree with that, or is that comparison appropriate?
It's a complex, dense question, because first we have to distinguish between the time in which manuscript tribal culture is the only technique for the reproduction of text, and the presence of the manuscript during the age of print, which was one of the important reappraisal of the history of the book or the history of reading, to consider the presence of scribal publication in the time of the print culture. If we think about the first question, that is to say, in Europe until the mid 15th century, it's difficult to I have no sufficient knowledge to answer about the marginalia in the manuscript, but it's clear that in this moment in which a lot of the fundamental work are based on the idea of a text which is at the center of a page, in which there are different layers or circles of marginalia. I suppose, and I imagine, perhaps I have seen some of the last presence of these glosses to glosses, commentary to commentary in the form of marginalia could be by the reader itself and not by one of the copyists of the manuscript, with a kind of sedimentation of marginalia, some integrated into the text and others just produced by the copyist or by the readers. This could be one of the way to think about this question of the marginalia in the manuscript culture. In themselves, at the age of print, they are an expression of the manuscript culture, because the marginalia are this not necessarily desired by the publisher or the author, presence of the reader within the text. And you are right to say it could be another place for the negotiation. The author cannot answer, but of course it's a way for establishing for the reader a dialogue. And sometimes, as I say, Renaissance for extracting and in a form of respect for not the text, but fragment of the text, after more in terms of dialogue, which can be a kind of opposition. The collection of the book with marginalia, if I remember, in Cambridge, was called Adversaria. That is to say, yeah, there is a topographic sense, but also you can imagine a form of this exchange with the text. But in this case, it seems to me that this presence of the manuscript practices within the printed text, even if the printed text was not hoping or desiring or waiting for, except some case when the edition is meant to receive some manuscript, for example, the edition of the classics for the college, or some of the almanacs in 18th-century England, in which you have some blank sheet and your leaves interfoliated into the book. But this is another way. And the last one, I think, what you say about the finalize the question, which is central now, of the mobility of the text. In the case of the printed print culture, printed edition, this mobility is given by the difference between one edition in relation to the previous one. Could be sometime introduced in the text itself, because the technical labor allow to make correction during the printing of the different sheet, and you have what is called stop press correction. You stop the press, you correct the text, and you start again the printing, which creates some differences between copies in the same edition. But it's more limited than what was described by the medievalists as the mobility or malleability of the text from one copy to another copy. Perhaps we have not to exaggerate either the fixity of print, because as I said, first, you have the possibility, at least until the 19th century, to have different copies within the same edition, and also you have this introduction of the plurality of text for the same work, which was a key element in my talk. So there is some malleability and mobility included in a technology described, for example, by Elizabeth Eisenstein as fixity. And conversely, this mouvance de la variante, it was the title of a book by Bernard Cerchiglini, this permanent mobility of the text. We have also, in some work which were often copied, a certain regularity of fixity. And it's not necessarily because it's manuscript that all the they could be different, because no one is writing exactly like another one. And so you have a mobility in perhaps the spelling, perhaps in the morphology of the text, but not necessarily because the text is changing its literality. And so there was perhaps a reappraisal also not to go too far in fixity versus mobility.
Right, thank you so much. I mean, it's a very important takeaway of your talk and your remarks about the globality of reading revolution as well, to not impose these polar oppositions between manuscript and reading culture. That's definitely very important. Thank you so much. So we have a question from an audience member, from Shehnaz Tahir, who says, thank you so much for a most inspiring talk. I have a question about the periodical press, and specifically the historical daily newspaper. With its immediacy and polyphonic structure, what is the extent to which it can be analyzed through the same tools as reading history or book history? In a way, she's asking if a historical newspaper, the periodical, and a book are to be categorized along the same lines.
Yeah, it seems to me the main difference is perhaps with the 19th century, because previously what we call newspaper were sort of often as if it was a book. And you have a lot of newspapers who are with a continuous pagination because they have to be put together, all the different issues at the end of the year in a volume. And so the similarity between a book and Gazette or the newspaper from the 17th to the 18th century is strong, particularly bibliographically, by this idea that you have a series which can be read separately, but also the finality is to have a book at the end of the year and to bring together all these different issues. When you enter in the 19th century, particularly the mid-19th century, with a daily newspaper and with the newspaper who are sold by issue and without this, except some collector who want to do this, but it's not seen and not inscribed into the text itself, or that has to be put together at the end of the year. You have another relationship with the with the press. Both belong evidently to the same kind of history of print culture, and during too long a time there was not sufficient work on the newspaper in relation with the work done on the books, but they belong in a different manner. You cannot approach in the same instrument or the same category the press in the until the mid-19th century and after the mid-19th century. Each would deserve a lot of observation. For the press before this mid-19th century, what is striking, of course, it belongs to this new practice of reading in the 18th century, which is appropriating and consuming ephemeral printed objects, labels, pamphlets, and the newspaper. What is also striking is the multiplication of the title and the fragility of each of them. And a lot of newspapers have no many issues because they disappear relatively rapidly. And I am not sure that in the perception of the contemporaries, except by the periodicity, there was such a great difference of appropriation or perception between some of the small formats, label and pamphlets, and issues of the newspaper. The time of the press, the era of the press, the change, I know on level for Europe in 19th century, when you have the distribution by the railways, you have a very low price for each issue. You have no more the obligation of a subscription. It was during the time in the first half of the 19th century remains important. You can buy as we do, we did, the newspaper by each issue separately. So here you and perhaps that for the impact of the print culture on a wide readership, this was more effect given by this press than by the books themselves. And if you think about other parts of the world, in all Latin America, it was in the newspaper or the journal that the novels were published in the form of the feuilleton, that some philosophical or historical debate were engaged. And so sometimes it was quite the inverted movement. It was the press which was absorbing what was the print culture in previously, whereas in 17th, 18th century, it was books which were the model for the press.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. We have another question from the audience. Elif Sezer would like to ask the role and function of chapbooks in the 17th and 18th centuries in the transformation of readership. She asks how they were interpreted in the history of reading in terms of materiality and in terms of the reading expectations that this format built.
Yeah. Also an interesting, important question, because of course it refers to a phenomena which late 16th century, the 17th century, appear in different form, but in all Europe. The chapbooks were the denomination for all these English pamphlets, in a sense of non-bound objects. The first meaning of pamphlet for the Stationers' Company is not the content of what we call now a pamphlet. It was the fact that it was a short printed object, and which was not destined to be bound. And so there were the chapbooks in England, the Bibliothèque Bleue in France, the Pliegos Sueltos in Spain. Everywhere they were at the late 16th century, beginning of the 19th century, by some publisher, the perception that there was a possible new market for the printed text. This new market was first in the cities, but the new market was constructed by the selection of some texts which were considered as possibly interesting a wider social public. Secondly, by the fact that they were sold by peddlers and not in the bookstores. And the third, by the fact that the cost was very low because it was not very refined or care edition, use of old types, a lot of misprints, and use of wooden engravings and not copperplate engravings and so on. And so this was the invention, in a sense, of a new readership. Because it was the offer was created first in the cities and after in the countryside. Earlier in England with the Chapman, there is a wonderful illustration of this in the Shakespeare's play, the Winter's Tale, in which you have the peddler Autolycus who is selling ballads, printed ballads to the peasants of an imaginary Bohemia. And so it was, as I said, the creation of a new market. It existed, but without this initiative of some publisher, perhaps it would be never activated. Here it was this possibility. The question was an issue much more difficult than the description of the genealogy or history of this popular print. It was the issue of how they were received by these readers. First, worker, small book, some small merchants, artisans in the cities, and after the upper class of the peasantry or the notable in the countryside. It's a very difficult question. It's generally a difficult question because how we can reconstruct was a reader of the, or perhaps until the 19th century, has left about their reading. We some archives of reading. If we follow the Certeau, by definition, reading is an activity which is not producing archives. It's an ephemeral moment of appropriation of a text. And we are not writing immediately what we have read and how we have read and what we have understood. It's an exception to have an archive about reading. Two kinds of archive, one you already mentioned, that is to say what some readers have written in their books. And if we have their books, we have what they have written, marginalia, but of course, it's a source which is very limited in relation with all the population of readers since the Middle Ages, and which is chronologically, socially very different for a more recent period than for 16th or 17th century. And so in the first, so this second one, it was the readers has written about their reading in letters, diaries, autobiographies, and so on, memories, memoir. But here too, It's limited socially and more important in a more recent period chronologically than in the 16th century. And in both cases, the presence of this popular readership for the popular print is quite inexistent. So the only way is to try to reconstruct what could, in the repertoire of the chapbooks, have an impact or activate some representation, preoccupation, fears, or cultural tradition, folkloric or carnivalesque, in this popular readership. But of course, it's an exercise which has not the same kind of proof than when you have a document which could be analyzed, and the analysis of the document can be checked and discussed. Here, we have to try to reconstruct in relation with what we know about the representation, the collective representation of this readership in the cities, in the countryside, and to question the repertoire of this text. Some are practical, others are largely the excerpt of chivalric novels, others could have been the adaptation of some of the contemporary texts, because in all these cases, and I conclude with this, but I was passionate by this topic, in all these cases, the texts were not written for this public. The editions were printed for this public, but not the text. And it's a decision of publisher to appropriate some text already existing and sold traditionally in the bookstore for another public that they thought could fit for the invention of this new market, with some information, some adaptation, and I have studied some of them in work on the French Bibliothèque Bleue. But clearly, this is another difficulty. These texts were not written for their popular readership. So how the popular readership can cope with texts which were not written within the mind of the author? This representation, expectation of the most popular part of the readership. But of course, it was a very important series of work for reframing the print culture in the early modern time.
Right. So thank you for that response. We have only a few minutes left.
As you like.
If I may ask one more question, I'm really fascinated by this notion of the medicalization of reading and intense reading, right? I would love to hear a little bit more about that, and maybe, since our audience questions are all about formats, format of periodical, format of chapbook versus book, were certain format considered to be more susceptible to making oneself fall ill? Are some books more dangerous than others, is my question. And are there any books that you'd like our audience to avoid to not become ill?
Well, the first one about medicalization, it was in the framework of the history of the fear vis-à-vis the excess of reading, and particularly this capture of the reader by the text. Don Quixote would be the majestic incarnation, embodiment of such a fear. And in the 18th century, the discourse about this fear of the capture of the reader, which is considered as a terrible peril because it's a form of separation with the society. And so this is kind of denial of the reality and absolute loneliness. The reason why is the same physician, particularly Tissot, who wrote about the onanism and the excess of reading, with the same background. That is to say, first, there is this immobility quite of the body, and which is contrary to all what the ritualistic form of exercise and relation of the body and the nature and the movement and so on. And secondly, because it's withdrawal from the social bound.
Right.
The medicalization of the discourse appeared with this, within this framework. Previously, as I say, it was more intellectual or categories which were applied to this excess of reading. And I think perhaps also the reason why Don Quixote could be exemplary, because there are always two discourse about reading. One which is fearing the peril, and the other one which is recognizing either the strength for communication of your knowledge or the force for the communication of emotions. And in the 18th century, as I said, there was also this idea that the bodily experience could be just the reverse of this solitary experience. It could be the fact that the emotion is translated, expressed by, and there is a famous description by Diderot of this ease reading attributed to author of Richardson novel, in which there is this total involvement of the body and tears, and as if the story had been incorporated by the reader. At the same time, the reader is projecting himself or herself into the fable. So this, the medicalization, which will remain in the 19th and 20th century, and particularly in some of the norms imposed to reading by the schools. And the discipline of the body, and not only your selection of what are the legitimate reading. There is also legitimate posture for writing and for reading. And the second question about the format, yes, it's a way for linking the two culture, the manuscript culture until the mid-15th century and after the print culture, because this hierarchy of format was already present in the world of the manuscript. The folio, Armando Petrucci has written about this, the folio book of the university, book of the scholasticism, book of the learning, and has to be put on the table. And with, as you said in your first question, the large format was quite a necessity, not only for recognizing the nobility of the text, but because you have this technique of introducing glosses and commentary to the glosses in the book itself. And so the large page was the only structure or space able to have, as we see in the 12th or 13th century manuscript, this series of glosses. But even in the age of the scribal culture, were also present the what we call now in quarto, the medium format, which was a book of the humanists in the 14th and 15th century, liberated from all this glossa and commentary, and just the text in a full page, but with a more modest volume, and also some small format, which exists as for the Petrucci, already a form of circulation by people putting the book in their pocket, or in a bag, libri di Bisaccia, or le libellus, le petit livre de devotion and piety. So this structure was existing, and it was, of course, thanks to the technique of printing, transformed into something more codified and more material. The hierarchy of format, the format depends only on the manner to fold the sheet of printing. If you fold only one time, you have a folio. If you fold twice, you have a quarto. If you fold the third 3 times, you have an octavo. So it was the hierarchy of the format was inscribed in the technique itself, and after was endowed by content. and remain the idea that the folio were books for sacrality, for learning, for encyclopedism, that the small format was this format for more popular users or popular readership, because you can have a use of the book even if it is a Greek or a Latin text, like in the Aldus Manutius booklet, but for the travel, for people bringing with them the book in the pocket, their clothes, or for the popular readership. And in the middle, you have this format in quarto, which is ambivalent, which could receive different kind of contact. There is a text by in the memoirs of Lord Chesterfield in the 18th century, we describe his day in the relation of the folio of the book, the format of the book is used. And he said he starts the morning by studying and by learning. So he has folio on the desk. In the evening, he has the company of the small format, because they are books for entertainment. And in the afternoon, the quarto, which are more mixed. He said more mixed material, and which correspond to different kind of literature, some book of philosophy or book of practical practices and so on. But it's a very interesting question, because you see here the connection between the material and technical element with cultural and intellectual content.
Exactly, perfect. Thank you. That's very interesting. We'll have to stop here, but I really want to thank you once again for a fascinating talk. We really enjoyed this very much, and we look forward to your new book as well. Thank you so much for being with us today. And for the audience, we hope to see you in the future installments of the Yavuz Sezer Memorial Talks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this invitation.